Hello everyone, it's your favorite Chanel in Space here, and if you play fighting games or look into their design or anything like that, you'll be well aware of character archetypes. And these are basically just archetypes that characters either within the same game or often outside the game fall into. This is not obviously complicated or revolutionary ideas, but one thing I've noticed is they've always been around the gameplay of the character specifically. Like, are they a grappler, a zoner, an all-arounder, etc., etc. And that's actually a perfectly valid way to classify them based because it's a video game. But I've always found funny that the actual character of the characters is rarely discussed when discussing fighting game character archetypes, or even to an extent fighting game characters as a whole, though to not quite the same degree, of course. So I wanted to make this video of what I consider to be some of the fighting game character archetypes. Basically what I consider common archetypes across most fighting games, or at the very least is seen as iconic to the genre in some way, shape, or form. Mostly I'm looking for, as my prime examples for this, Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and Tekken. I know some people would probably say some were more important to this, but that is the thing I'm going off, but you will see occasional examples from outside of them. Anyway, so let's begin. So for our first category, we are covering what I call the Bruce Lee clones. Now this is one of the few general character archetypes that people have actively acknowledged as being a character archetype and not just a gameplay one. These being characters like Fen Long, Liu Kang, and Martial Law. This is where I should probably say that I'm really bad at pronunciating things, so once again, sorry if I mispronounce. But this is a pretty well-recognized archetype of character who is heavily inspired by Bruce Lee. And it doesn't take a genius to look at these characters, especially their earliest versions, and they wanted to have Bruce Lee here. There isn't really much to say about this archetype. They are, the martial arts masters. They usually, they can be kind of all over the moral alignment spectrum, but they tend to very much be very focused on fighting in a very Bruce Lee kind of style. But they usually have a little bit of fun or silliness to them, built in, once again, Bruce Lee clone. Next is what I'm calling the Kami Commandos, which named after Kami of Street Fighter, but also has Sonya Blade and Nina Williams. These characters I basically could be now. These are a little bit different than a later archetype we'll see, but these are usually some chick who has some kind of military or personnel or a mercenary, that kind of strain to them. They're usually either somewhat uptight or at least very professional in their aspect, or at least professional by fighting game standards. Professionality is kind of a joke in the fighting game universe, but regardless, they usually have at least a fair bit of kicks to them, but also tend to employ gadgets at least to some degree. And by gadgets, that can range anything from gauntlets that do energy attacks to just straight up guns, because, why not? Now, to pair up with the next one, you have the U.S. Army Man of Guile Jackson Laws Amerson. Now, I'm aware that the U.S. part is not really applying to Laws as he's not American, but it's close enough. Now, these characters are very much a archetype I don't think anyone has acknowledged, being the super American military guy who's fighting for his country and his people, and he's usually at least somewhat strict, but less strict and more disciplined, often having a certain amount of care for people, and often serving as a leader, at least in some capacity in the team, although rarely the main character of a story. But usually they're a fairly solid moral foundation for their allies. Weirdly enough, they seem to use gadgets and technology less than the Kami Commando characters, but that's not universal. Obviously, Jax is over there with the metal arms. Next up is the Hotshot American. This one I consider so common, it's kind of funny. This is where we get Ken Masters, Johnny Cage, Paul Phoenix, and Terry. These basically are, what they say on the name, hotshot Americans. They're loud, they're boisterous, they're definitely prideful, but they got the skills to back up their ego. These are very much a classic archetype in fighting games. It should not be surprising when two of the biggest names in fighting game, Ken Masters and Johnny Cage, are part of this archetype. Theoretically, you could attach a fame archetype to them, but I don't think it's necessary for the archetype to work. They don't have to be famous, they just have to be a bit egotistical, very American, at least in attitude, and generally speaking, they got a bit of an ego to them. Weirdly enough, it's kind of fun because they're usually not full-on the main character of the franchise, usually they're secondary to someone else, to a point, but oftentimes are nearly equal to that main character, but often also have more stuff going on. It's a weird trend I've noticed. Next up is the Native American Spirit Warrior, which someone's going to kill me for saying that, but I can do what I want. These are where we get the characters like Thunderhawk, Nightwolf, and Julie Chang. Yeah, I said that last one. But basically, these are characters who are, very Native American inspired in their design. Which tribe or area doesn't actually particularly matter, although once again, it can be kind of wherever they want. They often, but not always, have some kind of connection to spirits, either giving them based on their powers or whatnot, or very likely some connection to wind, at least in that capacity. These are usually often fairly wise characters to at least some degree, and overall, they're just a pretty fun archetype, because you can't really go wrong with a guy in blue jeans beating you down with a tomahawk. That's just cool. Next up is probably what I consider to be the most controversial pick, but I can do what I want. This is going to be Heroes with a Dark Side, where I'm putting Ryu, Raiden, and Jin. These are surprisingly often the main character, or at least one of the main characters of that respective franchise. They're usually a character who on some levels on some point, a wholesome or at least well-meaning individual, but has some element to them that is often pulling them to do dark or evil things. This is usually tied to their abilities in some way, particularly with Ryu and Jin's case. But then there's this Raiden that just kind of seems to be his personality to a point. It's hard to tell. But usually their archetype or the story will either involve them trying to fight off their dark, worst impulses, or giving into them and becoming a villain after a point. You can kind of see all three of them play around that to different degrees. But I consider it so common in fighting games as an archetype, I'm shocked no one has noticed this before. And next up for this section, we have martial arts chicks. This is where we get Chun-Li, Katana, Zanlo, I really pronounced that everyone, and Mao. I don't think I need to describe this archetype. I probably could have just called this the Chun-Li archetype and called it a day, but you understand what they are. They're martial art chicks. I don't really know what else I need to say to you. They often can end up being a love interest. It's funny, because they're often described as a love interest to the main character of a franchise, but that's not always actually consistent. Sometimes it is, sometimes not. But either way, you can bet the fans will ship them to No Tomorrow, because that's just kind of how it works. But oh well. Now, let's move on to the next archetype of the big bad evil guy, where you find M. Bison, Shao Kahn, and Kazu. I can't say that name right. For crying out loud, whatever. The point is, these are the big bad evil guys of their franchise. They are the bad guy in many ways. Yes, some other villains may just stage them for a game or two, and yes, they may not always be technically the most powerful, but you can better believe, like a Saturday morning cartoon villain, they'll come back to try to ruin the hero's day once again. They're usually fairly, big characters, at least to some degree, very intimidating, and even if they aren't technically the most powerful villain in the franchise, you better believe their sheer aura will make you think twice before you mess with them. Some ancient guy you never heard of, maybe he's not that bad, but you know when M. Bison or Shao Kahn walk into the room, they're gonna be throwing hands. Next up is the first villain to Starscream archetype, where we see Sagat, Shang Tsung, and Heihachi. Now, this is definitely one of the more hypothetical things I've noticed, but particularly with the three big franchises I'm covering here, there's a weird trend I've noticed where you have the villain of the first game get upstaged by the villain of the second game, whether like bigger, badder, or whatever, whether they work with the villain or not, or actively fight against them, but they kind of get upstaged, and that overall becomes the status quo of the franchise. All three of the characters I listed are still major players in their respective franchises, especially Heihachi and Shang Tsung, but yet they always kind of play second fiddle to the bad guy who showed up in the second game. Now, this is in some ways a bit of an outer universe archetype, but it also applies usually narratively within the franchise as well. They play some kind of secondary role, but often are iconic in their own right and should not be discounted. It's also very likely that at least once, if not multiple times, these guys will try to overthrow the main bad guy to limited success. Next is Inhumans with the Bros. This is where I'm putting Blanca, Cyrax, and Eliza. Now, what does that mean? These are basically characters who, by the standards of the franchise they're in, are inhuman, monstrous, or just look kind of weird, by whatever standards that game has. But, despite that, are deeply good, at least on some level, and hang out with the heroes, and overall are considered part of the hero team by all accounts. These are not tragic monsters in the sense of they're fighting against their darker urges. No, they're fully on team good guy and should be considered as such. These guys usually have some kind of character arc about accepting their conditions sometimes, but how well that's handled or how much that gets reset back to the angst can be vary. Next up is the big buff guy. This is where Zangief, Gore, and King hang out. There's not a whole lot to say here, not because they aren't interesting, but because they're kind of everything they say on the tin. They're the big buff guy. What do? Well, they're gonna probably grapple you or do some tricks like that. They're tanky, probably slow, but you don't mess with them, and they almost always have some kind of wrestling gimmick. Probably do all the grappling. There's not too much to say here. Whether the good guys or villains can split randomly, heck, half these characters have flip morality constantly, but usually they have some kind of honor code at least. Next up is the Bloody Vampire, where we get Natara, Ilza, Dimitri, and Slayer. This is literally just vampires. I don't know how, but of all the supernatural monsters, almost every fighting game franchise will usually have some kind of vampire somewhere in it. It's just kind of like an unspoken rule that there's just vampires in these franchises, and the archetype can kind of go all over the place. And realistically, I don't know if this counts, but I've just noticed how often there's usually like one random vampire in a fighting game IP that just shows up out of nowhere. Like, it makes sense in something like Darkstalkers, but then it's like, it's like every fighting game, almost every fight has like one vampire who's just shown up, and like I just kind of want to acknowledge that. I just think it's a funny observation. Next up is the quote-unquote hot evil chick, where Julie, Melina, and Morgana hang out. These are basically just hot evil chick. There's not a whole lot. They run the gamut of whether they're intentionally subjective in the universe or just the internet thinks them that way. And I put hot with air quotes because, like, it's a type thing. I don't usually find most of these hot personally, but I know that they are at least designed to be attractive, and the internet will disagree with me vehemently. They usually rivals to some other chick in the cast, usually Morgana being the exception. She's the main character of our franchise. And overall, they can serve as a dark mirror in a sense, which is funny because a lot of fighting games have that kind of archetype of the evil rival character, but yet it's not cohesive enough usually to be its own archetype, weirdly enough. Next up is Martial Arts Old Masters, Goten, Bo-Bai-Cho, and Rang Jin. Once again, this is one, man, I really butchers all those names, but I don't think I need to explain much of what this is. Fighting games take a lot from martial arts media in so many different ways, see the Bruce Lee above, so naturally you have to have an old guy who knows Kung Fu. It's just a legal obligation. If you fail to meet this criteria, you will be drugged into a back alley and beat up and then forced to wipe the floors until you learn Kung Fu. Their actual character can shift quite a bit between how much they're the serious or silly version of the archetype, or how much they matter in the story, or how often. Once again, it's heavily variable, but they always show up somehow. Next up is the Shadow Wizard Fighting Gang, where we have ancient powerful evils. This is where we find Akuma, Onaga, Ogre, Azazel, Jipachi, Kazumi. Okay, seriously. And of course, Akuma again. Tekken has a lot of these guys. But more importantly, these are oftentimes the more technical, true, big bad of the franchise, the most powerful, evil, dark master of them all, who's technically above the big bad boss, but will usually star in less games than them. But overall, these are like the height of evil in the franchise. This could be the big thing that games are building up to slowly, or more accurately, they show up in one game where they serve as the big bad, and then games retroactively build them up with like prequels and out of continuity things, but I digress. No, there isn't too much of an archetype with these guys, but expect some of their abilities to deeply tie into like a corrupted version of the powers the heroes use, or has some ancient magic or abilities or something like that. And unlike the big bad boss who usually wants to rule the world, these guys usually want to end it. Unless you're Akuma, he just kind of wants to fight people. But overall, those are what I call the fighting game character archetypes. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's more of an observation video I want to make, but don't really talk about, like I said, the character of fighting game characters. They just talk about the gameplay usually. So I wanted to kind of remedy that here. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you. If you like this video, comment down below and tell me what you like. If you don't like this, dislike and tell me down below. If you want to tell me your ideas for more archetypes that fighting games that show up, or characters that would fit in some of these categories, please tell down below, and I will see you all next time.